What if the Jesus most of the world pictures in stained glass and Renaissance paintings is only one face of a far older, stranger portrait, one that once shone so fiercely it was described as blinding? That is the claim at the center of this investigation, not a conspiracy of secrets, but a historical fact worth exploring. Ethiopian Christianity preserved books and images of Christ that are vivid, cosmic, and at times dramatically different from the familiar Western portrayals. We will trace those texts, the monasteries that kept them safe, the scholarly conversations they generate, and then ask how a modern filmmaker, Mel Gibson, enters into that long, complicated visual conversation about who Jesus is. To begin, some practical orientation. When scholars say the Ethiopian Bible, they are not speaking of a small variant of the Roman or Protestant collections. They are speaking of a living canon with a scope that surprises many Western observers. In various Ethiopian Orthodox traditions, the scriptural corpus extends well beyond the 66 books of a typical Protestant Old and New Testament, and even beyond the 73 books of many Catholic Bibles. Depending on local practice and manuscript tradition, the total number is often placed in the 80s, collections that include, among other writings, 1 Enoch, Jubilees, the Ascension of Isaiah, and other works preserved in Ge'ez, the classical liturgical language of Ethiopia. Many of these texts survive in full only in Ge'ez manuscripts. They vanished elsewhere or survive only in fragments and quotations in Greek, Aramaic, or Latin. The reasons for this difference are straightforward and complex at once. Geography matters. The Christian communities that took root in what is now Ethiopia developed in relative isolation from the church centers of Alexandria, Antioch, and Rome. Over centuries, that isolation became a preservation advantage. While councils, imperial authorities, and urban church networks in the Mediterranean sought to define boundaries, Ethiopian monasteries copied and treasured texts that fit their liturgical and devotional life. Those manuscripts were stored in mountain sanctuaries, carried by itinerant monks, and hidden in caves when danger loomed. The survival of these books is as much a story of remote devotion and careful copying as it is a story of textual value. If you want more deep dives into biblical history like this, like and subscribe. Your support helps us keep digging into the texts and traditions that shape faith. Now, what do these particular Ethiopian texts say about Jesus, and why has that imagery sometimes been read as shocking when compared with Western images of Christ? Let's look at 3 core texts that are especially significant for this discussion: 1 Enoch, the Ascension of Isaiah, and Jubilees.
Each of these belongs to a broader literary landscape, often called Second Temple Jewish literature and early Christian apocalyptic and visionary writing, genres that imagine cosmic judges, heavenly thrones, angelic hierarchies, and startling, often luminous depictions of the divine. 1 Enoch, a collection of various visionary materials composed and compiled in the centuries before and around the start of the Common Era, was widely read in many Jewish and Christian circles in antiquity. It narrates journeys into the heavens, descriptions of cosmic machinery, and an exalted figure sometimes called the Son of Man. The Enochic Son of Man is not merely a meek teacher on a hillside. He is an enthroned, dazzling presence. He carries the authority of cosmic judgment, and the language that surrounds him often uses fire and radiant light as metaphors for divine power. Scholars date portions of 1 Enoch between roughly the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, though the text is composite and developed over time. What matters for our purposes is that images we now associate with the later book of Revelation, streams of fire, a majestic judge opening the heavenly court, appear in Enochic materials earlier or in parallel. Scholars debate whether Revelation drew directly from Enoch or whether both draw from a shared apocalyptic imagination circulating in Jewish and early Christian communities. Either way, the parallels are striking. The Ascension of Isaiah is another jewel in this constellation. It is a layered, composite work that mixes prophetic narrative with vivid heavenly ascent, an account of Isaiah's transport into heaven, his witnessing of celestial secrets, and at times an intense Christological focus. In certain passages, the divine or pre-existent figure descends through heavenly layers and clothes himself with humility to enter human existence. The language describes a stripping away of pre-existent glory, a movement from cosmic throne room into the vulnerability of flesh. Some interpreters read this as a radical portrayal of incarnation, one that emphasizes both pre-existence and the voluntary self-emptying of the divine. Dating the Ascension is contested. Many scholars see it as a text with multiple strata, perhaps containing early material from the 1st centuries BCE or CE, combined with later Christian redaction. But in Ethiopian Christology, this layered ascent and descent contributed to a sense of Jesus as one who traverses cosmic realms, both radiant and vulnerable. The Book of Jubilees, though less overtly apocalyptic than Enoch, reshapes biblical chronology and presents a framework for covenantal history that was influential in some regional churches. It reinforces a world in which divine presence is integrated into history, ritual, and the moral order of the cosmos.
In the Ethiopian liturgical imagination, such books underpin a theology in which salvation is not only courtroom justification, but an unveiling and restoration of the world's original radiant order. Taken together, these texts fuel a Christological picture that can be described, without exaggeration, as cosmic. In their pages, Jesus, or figures identified with him, is associated with overwhelming light, with courtly judgments, and sometimes with language of hair like white wool, faces brighter than the sun, voices like many waters, images meant to evoke in the reader an encounter with the utterly other. That cosmic Christ coexists in these traditions with images of suffering and humility. The tension between glory and kenosis, the self-emptying of divinity, is a central theological problem explored by these writings. It is important here to be precise about what scholars claim and what they do not. When academics note parallels between Enochic imagery and Revelation, they are not asserting a neat line of literary influence in every case. Rather, they point to shared themes and motifs in an apocalyptic imagination that circulated across communities in the ancient Near East and Mediterranean. Likewise, when we look at the Ethiopian canon, we are not dealing with a single monolithic dogma that proves or disproves later theological formulations. These texts open windows into diversity. They demonstrate how early Jewish and Christian communities explored the identity of the divine agent in a variety of symbolic languages. So why didn't these books become part of the standard Western canon? The short answer is that canon formation was not a single event, nor was it merely a clerical plot. Instead, it unfolded across centuries, shaped by practical needs, pastoral concerns, and regional preferences. In the first few centuries of the Church, there was considerable fluidity about which writings were read publicly and which were treated with caution. Church leaders often distinguished between books universally read and those that prompted debate. Political developments, such as the conversion of the Roman Empire to Christianity, added an ecclesial urgency to establishing boundaries that would promote unity and orthodoxy across wide, diverse territories. Certain texts were especially vulnerable to exclusion when they seemed to lend themselves to heterodox readings or when their origins were obscure. Geographic distance intensified this effect. Texts that continued to circulate in the eastern or southern peripheries of Christendom were less likely to be known, copied, and recommended by council fathers in Constantinople or by bishops in Rome. Over time, lists of accepted books became more standardized in the Greek and Latin churches. Athanasius's 367 letter, for example, is often cited as an important moment in the West for articulating a 27-book New Testament, though regionally other lists and usages persisted. The Ethiopian Church, outside the direct oversight of metropolitan sees that shaped Mediterranean canons, continued a robust manuscript culture that embraced a broader textual horizon. Preservation in Ethiopia was not merely passive inheritance, it was an active monastic enterprise. Ethiopian monasteries, often perched on remote promontories, dotting mountain islands, and hidden in rugged highlands, served as libraries and scriptoria. Monks copied texts, compiled local lectionaries, and reinforced liturgical practices that made certain books indispensable. When political turmoil or invasions threatened manuscripts elsewhere, the relative stability and seclusion of some Ethiopian communities allowed unique works to survive. The result is that scholars today often rely on Ethiopian witnesses, on Gia's manuscripts, to reconstruct textual forms that have disappeared from other traditions. Enter Mel Gibson, a modern cinematic voice intent on making the devotional and desert worlds of the Gospels viscerally present. Gibson's best-known work on the life of Jesus, The Passion of the Christ, made a deliberate aesthetic choice to emphasize the physicality and the brutal suffering of Jesus. It relied heavily on an embodied, sacrificial imagination, close-ups of flesh, lingering attention to wounds, a visual language designed to provoke empathy and horror. For many viewers, Gibson's film offered a corrective to sanitized portrayals, a reminder of the flesh and blood cost of crucifixion. For others, it risked narrowing the picture of Jesus to suffering alone. What happens when we place Gibson's aesthetic next to the radiant, apocalyptic images preserved in Ethiopian literature? There is both consonance and dissonance. Gibson's focus on corporality aligns with the historical impulse in many Eastern and Western traditions to honor Christ's humanity. Yet the Ethiopian texts often emphasize a cosmic theatricality, brightness, throne room authority, and apocalyptic judgment that contrasts with Gibson's searing up-close intimacy. One could say Gibson shows us the human who walks through suffering.
Ethiopian literature often insists the same human is also the transfiguring center of cosmic order. That apparent tension is not a contradiction so much as a theological depth charge. Early writers, liturgists, and communities were working with a multi-dimensional image of Jesus as both humble sufferer and cosmic king. The ascension of Isaiah's layered descent and one Enoch's enthroned Son of Man are not remote curiosities. They contribute to an imagination in which Christ is simultaneously the one who enters human fragility and the one whose presence reorients the heavens. Cinema, with its capacity for intimate realism and symbolic amplification, joins that conversation in its own way.
Gibson's films deploy an unforgiving realism to make the physical stakes felt. Other cinematic choices, lighting, color grading, iconographic shots, could as easily emphasize the luminous and cosmic dimensions found in Ethiopian manuscripts. The interesting point is not that some modern filmmaker has discovered a hidden truth, but that different media highlight different theological facets that have always been present in the tradition. What are the theological consequences if we take seriously a tradition that tends to picture salvation as awakening to an inner light as much as ascribing it to institutional mediation? In certain Ethiopian liturgical and theological streams, you find motifs of the human as child of light, a creature whose deepest vocation is to participate in and be illumined by divine radiance. That language shifts the spiritual emphasis in ways pastoral life notices. Salvation becomes less simply a juridical transaction, debate about sin and penalty, and more a transformative restoration, an awakening to a participation in a restored cosmic order. Such an anthropology does not necessarily reject the role of church sacraments or communal mediation, but it places a strong positive emphasis on inward illumination and personal transformation. That emphasis raises healthy questions for any tradition that has tended to centralize authority. Canonical narrowing in the West was often motivated by a need for consistent teaching and pastoral protection, especially during turbulent theological seasons. Those same moves, though, sometimes sideline texts that could have enriched liturgical imaginations with motifs of cosmic transformation. The result is a Christian memory that in some places leans more heavily on juridical language, while in others continues to sing with a vision of cosmic restoration. Recognizing that diversity invites Christians to ask what aspects of faith have been emphasized or muted by historical developments, and whether re-engaging certain traditions might renew aspects of piety without undermining doctrinal care. We must be careful, however, not to romanticize the past or to treat Ethiopian preservation as proof of superior orthodoxy. The history of canon formation includes legitimate concerns about texts that circulated with dubious origins or that gave rise to doctrinal confusion. Pastoral leaders sometimes acted prudently to protect vulnerable communities. At the same time, the geographical and political dynamics that shaped which books were read widely and which fell into obscurity deserve our attention precisely because they show how human contingencies, language barriers, travel routes, monastic networks have shaped what counts as normative scripture. Returning to the emotional center of our inquiry, imagine a passage from one of these Ethiopian preserved works.
A reader encounters a figure who radiates like a host of suns, whose voice rolls like distant waters, before whom the wicked are judged, and the faithful are called to awake to their hidden kinship with light. Such images are meant to jar and to comfort, to frighten and to invite. They tell a story of God's power and also of human calling. If you first encounter Jesus portrayed as a suffering man in a film like Gibson's, and then turn to a manuscript that insists on his blinding glory, you are meeting two theological claims that together form a richer portrait. The one refuses to let us forget solidarity in suffering. The other refuses to let us forget the cosmic reach of redemption. How should a contemporary viewer or believer approach this archive without falling into two traps, either of sensationalism, they hid the truth, or dismissive ignorance, these texts don't matter? First, treat the manuscripts as historically situated artifacts. Each line and image carries a theological argument and a devotional purpose. Second, respect the communities, particularly the Ethiopian Orthodox Church, that have entrusted these books for centuries as living scripture and liturgy. Third, engage the scholarship. Textual critics, historians of early Christianity, and specialists in Ge'ez manuscripts provide frameworks to date and contextualize texts,
and to explain how motifs migrated across regions and languages. There is also a practical caveat regarding claims about influence. When scholars propose that motifs in Enoch anticipate language later found in Revelation, they are identifying parallels, shared metaphors, similar cosmic topography, not necessarily direct borrowing. In antiquity, stories and symbols flowed through a shared cultural bloodstream. To say an image in Enoch and an image in Revelation resemble each other is to point to a common imaginative vocabulary, not to litigate proprietorship over theological truth. What then of Mel Gibson as cultural actor in this story? He is an interpreter who tried to make us feel the horrors of crucifixion, and in so doing, reminded a broad audience of Jesus' embodied suffering. He did not mine Ethiopian manuscripts for cosmic imagery in a systematic way, nor should we expect film to substitute for textual exegesis. Yet Gibson's cinema does participate in the broader cultural task of visualizing Scripture. His films show how powerful images can shape devotion and belief, sometimes beneficially, sometimes in one-dimensional ways. If filmmakers want to draw on ancient apocalyptic and ascension literature honestly, their work would benefit from engaging the text's symbiotic tensions, the light that dazzles and the flesh that endures. As we draw toward the center of our inquiry, consider this. Images shape piety, whether through stained glass, icon frescoes, manuscripts, or movies. The picture we hold of Jesus informs prayer, social ethics, and the way we understand suffering and hope.
If a tradition like the Ethiopian Church preserves a picture of a radiant, cosmic Christ alongside narratives of humble incarnation and suffering, then modern Christians might take that as an invitation to hold more than one image in creative tension. We need not choose simplistically between cosmic and human Christologies. Both testify to dimensions of the same mystery. There is a temptation in popular conversation to turn historical complexity into headlines. Secret books prove X, but the responsible posture is curiosity with restraint. The shocking aspect of the Ethiopian witness is not that it undermines all other histories, but that it expands our imagination. What has been preserved in Giaz invites us to think of Jesus not only as the neighbor who bears wounds, but also as a presence whose radiance reorders the cosmos. If Mel Gibson's films push us to feel the cost of the crucifixion, the Ethiopian manuscripts push us to imagine the scale of what is being restored. Practically speaking, if you want to explore this further, there are accessible steps. Retranslations of 1st Enoch, the Ascension of Isaiah, and Jubilees with an eye for poetic imagery and symbolic function. Consult reputable secondary scholarship that situates these works within Second Temple Judaism and early Christian apocalypticism. Visit museum collections online that host Giaz manuscripts and look at high-resolution images to see how illuminators rendered light, color, and form. And crucially, listen to the living communities, monks, liturgists, and scholars within the Ethiopian Orthodox tradition who continue to interpret these texts in worship and communal life. In the end, what should move us is less the discovery of a single sensational truth than the expansion of our theological imagination. If early writers and Ethiopian scribes preserve images of a Son of Man who is simultaneously judge, luminous king, and humble servant, then contemporary faith communities are offered a richer palette for worship and reflection. Images matter because they shape who we become. Do we cultivate a faith that remembers suffering without losing sight of cosmic hope? Do we allow the Church's institutional structures to hold and interpret text responsibly while remaining open to the spiritual awakenings those texts can inspire? Which image of Christ speaks most deeply to you? The radiant cosmic Lord who blinds and restores, or the suffering human neighbor who accompanies us in pain? Or do you find yourself holding both images together, insisting that theology must be capable of the paradox? Tell us in the comments which portrayal moves you and why. Your reflections help build a conversation rather than a verdict. If this exploration has ignited your curiosity, share the video with someone who cares about the history of the Bible and the cultural ways we imagine the sacred.
Check the description for recommended readings in primary texts if you want reliable starting points for study. Above all, approach these texts with both wonder and scholarly care. The Ethiopian manuscripts do not erase other traditions, but they remind us that the story of Jesus, complex, contested, luminous, and human, has always exceeded any single frame.